Video 2, Methods and Key Barriers. Part 1. One primary objective of this project was to identify the key barriers to First Nations economic development on reserve using a systematic review of the literature. The following primary inclusion criterion was used to select the literature that is featured in the review. The source must involve direct input from First Nations representatives. Direct input was defined as primary research involving direct consultation of representatives from First Nations communities in the form of roundtable discussions, interviews, or using other direct consultation techniques. The following secondary inclusion criteria was used to further narrow in on the appropriate literature for the barriers component in the review. The source must offer insight into key barriers to economic development faced by First Nations communities on reserve. Ultimately, 13 pieces of literature met the criteria for inclusion. The information gathered from the chosen literature was synthesized and distilled to present a unique and comprehensive picture of the barriers to economic development experienced by First Nations on reserve. The key barriers that surfaced in the literature were organized into 3 categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary. In part 1 of this 2-part video, we limit the discussion to primary barriers. The reason for the categorization was to demonstrate the extent to which barriers to economic development are interrelated. Primary barriers inform or directly generate all other barriers to economic development on reserve. Secondary barriers manifest as a result of the primary barriers and create tertiary barriers. Tertiary barriers also work in the opposite direction to influence and reinforce secondary barriers. Finally, tertiary barriers are themselves interrelated. The primary barriers are the following: oppressive systems, challenging legal and regulatory environment, and financial restrictions. To accurately represent the relationship between primary barriers, they are represented by 3 overlapping circles which contain and influence all others. Speaking generally, oppressive systems work to block economic development on reserve. Aboriginal communities in Canada have faced and continue to face extreme disenfranchisement and mistreatment at the hands of colonial powers. Chief of McLeod Lake Indian Band, Derek Orr, states that industry's lack of understanding around Indigenous histories and the impact of colonization is a major barrier to maintaining healthy and equitable partnerships for economic development. The literature makes it clear that a challenging legal and regulatory environment for Aboriginal communities on reserve rests upon a foundation of oppressive systems. As the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board articulates in their 2013 report, the Indian Act, under which the vast majority of reserves operate, was never designed to accommodate the economic aspirations of First Nations. As a result, the Act is overrun by unique rules that, as implemented, pose obstacles to business development and investment. A challenging legal and regulatory environment for First Nations on reserve has resulted in frustrating and damaging financial restrictions. All sources reviewed for this report identified some form of financial restriction as a barrier to economic development. The Chinaksa-Kinbasket Tribal Council identifies the lack of collateral available to First Nations on reserve as a significant barrier to securing financing. This is exactly the kind of barrier to funding that is the direct result of a challenging legal and regulatory environment, and which itself is the result of oppressive systems that continue to function today.